Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer. Today, we're doing something really fascinating. We're mapping out the complete, incredibly intense journey of a United States soldier. We're going to look at the massive machinery that builds this force, the absolute crucible of forging an elite fighter, and the profound, often totally hidden realities of what happens when these men and women actually see combat. And just as importantly, what happens when they finally make it back home. So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, building the armed forces. Then, forging elite soldiers. After that, we hit the reality of combat, followed by a deep dive into Operation Black Hawk Down. And finally, we'll cover the return home. All right, part one, building the armed forces. To really wrap our heads around the life of a single soldier, we first got to zoom way out and look at the sheer, almost mind-boggling scale of the organization they're stepping into. I mean, this is an institution designed for constant global readiness, right? They're deploying everywhere, from literal war zones to domestic natural disaster sites, at the drop of a hat. Just think about this number, 1.5 million. That is the staggering amount of active duty soldiers in the U.S. military, and they're backed by a colossal annual budget of over $700 billion. They've got a footprint on almost every continent, from Iraq to Korea, Italy to Australia. It's literally the most powerful military on the planet. But here's the catch. Maintaining a machine of this size, it requires a massive, non-stop influx of new recruits. So you might be wondering, how exactly do they convince 150,000 young Americans to sign on the dotted line every single year? Well, the military actually acts as this incredibly powerful socioeconomic ladder. For a lot of young folks out there, especially those coming from lower income backgrounds, these benefits aren't just perks. They're completely life-changing. We're talking enlistment bonuses that can hit up to $40,000 just for infantry roles. Add in free housing with all utilities paid, $4,000 a year in college tuition assistance, plus full medical and dental coverage. It's a hugely effective recruitment engine, basically built on the promise of real financial security and upward mobility. Moving on to part two, forging elite soldiers. Okay, so once that contract is signed, the real transformation kicks off. The military has to take those 150,000 everyday civilians, and remember, a lot of these are literally teenagers who've never even lived away from their parents, and mold them into a tight, cohesive fighting force. Now, the ads you see on TV, they're super slick, high budget, almost like a video game, complete with these spectacular Golden Knights parachute shows. It looks exactly like an action movie. But the reality? Well, basic training at places like Fort Jackson, which handles about 50,000 recruits a year, is a total shock to the system. It's 4 a.m. wake-ups, it's constant, high-stress yelling from drill sergeants. We're talking grueling 12-hour days where absolute perfection is the baseline, because as the instructors constantly remind them, this isn't a game. They're building a force where a single mistake can literally cost lives. But preparation for this kind of life sometimes starts way before someone ever walks into a recruiting office. Military culture runs deep in the U.S., really deep. Take the Missouri Military Academy, for example. Parents are actually paying $34,000 a year to send their 13 to 19-year-olds to a private boarding school that basically mirrors a strict military barracks. These kids are doing 6 a.m. pajama inspections, folding hospital corners on their beds, and dealing with intense, peer-led discipline. It's an entire environment engineered to forge leadership and stamina way before these teens even hit adulthood. Now, for the folks who join up and decide they want to reach the absolute pinnacle of the military, the testing goes so far beyond basic training, it's almost unbelievable. Just look at the best Ranger competition. This is where the truly elite separate themselves. The limits they push the human body and mind to here are nuts. Try to imagine going 72 hours straight with zero sleep, none. And during that time, you're rucking 112 kilometers on foot, loaded down with heavy gear, all while knocking out 20 intense combat events like sniper shooting and hostage rescue. This is the absolute jagged edge of human endurance, built to find the best of the best. Which brings us to part three, the reality of combat. Because ultimately, all of that grueling training, the extreme discipline, the endless physical conditioning, it's all preparation for the utter chaos and deadly reality of war. To really understand what that looks like on the ground, we're going to focus in on a very specific historical event. Back in 1993, an elite assault force known as Task Force Ranger, which was made up of Army Rangers and Delta Force operators, was deployed to Mogadishu, Somalia. Authorized by General William Garrison, the mission honestly sounded straightforward on paper. drop into a target building, snatch up the top lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah I did, and get out. It was flawlessly planned, and it was supposed to take an hour, tops. Let's look at Part 4, Operation Black Hawk Down. We're going to step right into the intense microcosm of the soldier's experience here, tracing the hour-by-hour reality of a highly specialized raid that just completely unraveled. I want you to follow this timeline with me because the pacing shifts so fast it'll give you whiplash. At the 15-minute mark, the raid is a total success. Targets are secured. But then, an enemy rocket-propelled grenade hits a helicopter. Hour 1, the first Black Hawk crashes into the hostile city streets. In a split second, a quick snatch and grab becomes a desperate rescue mission. Hour 2, a second Black Hawk goes down half a mile away, fracturing the rescue forces. What was supposed to be a 60-minute mission suddenly spirals into a terrifying overnight urban siege. You've got less than 100 elite American soldiers totally surrounded by a mob of thousands of armed militia. It literally took until dawn for a heavily armored UN rescue convoy to finally break through and get them out. So what happens to a soldier's mindset when the grand strategy just completely disintegrates? One of the Rangers on the ground during that horrific firefight absolutely nailed it with this quote. He said, "We weren't fighting for the flag. You're fighting for each other." You see, in the absolute meat grinder of urban combat, facing down thousands of enemies, all those grand geopolitical goals, they instantly vanish. They are replaced 100% by the Ranger Creed. You do not leave a fallen comrade behind. These guys fought through the entire night, taking heavy casualties for one simple reason: to keep the men to their left and right alive, and to bring the bodies of those downed pilots home. The aftermath of those 14 hours was just devastating. 18 Americans were dead, along with one Malaysian peacekeeper who had helped in the rescue. On the Somali side, the death toll was over 500. And here's the crazy paradox of the whole thing. The targets were actually captured. Tactically speaking, it was a success, but strategically and politically, it was a profound disaster. Seeing the visual of American casualties in Mogadishu completely upended U.S. foreign policy, and it directly led to the total withdrawal of American forces from Somalia. And that leads us to our final chapter, Section 5, the return home. When the dust finally settles and the deployments end, the life cycle of a soldier hits its final and honestly, often its most difficult phase, reintegrating back into civilian life. And man, the post-military experience is a study in massive extremes. On one hand, you have incredible entrepreneurial success. Did you know 1 in 20 veterans start their own businesses? They take all that intense focus and discipline they learned and channel it. For example, former Navy SEAL Eli Crane used his background to build a massively successful $1.2 million bottle opener company. Pretty awesome, right? But flip that coin, and the other side is a really heavy psychological toll. Over 500,000 veterans from just the Iraq and Afghanistan wars alone are living with combat trauma, depression, and severe PTSD. And that brings us to a tragic reality that we absolutely have to address in this explainer. The veteran suicide rate is a full-blown national crisis in the United States. The numbers tell a stark story. The rate of suicide among veterans is nearly double that of the general population. Every single year, roughly 6,000 former soldiers take their own lives. That is a heartbreaking statistic, and it just shows how deeply the invisible wounds of combat continue to bleed long after these soldiers have stepped off the battlefield. So how do they cope? Well, a lot of veterans find that the best way forward is to recreate that profound sense of camaraderie they had back in the service. That brings us to groups like the Sons of Blackwater Motorcycle Club. For these folks, getting on a bike isn't just a weekend hobby, it's literal therapy. It's a way to quiet the noise of PTSD. And they use this newly forged brotherhood not just to survive day to day, but to advocate. We're talking thousands of veterans riding together to Washington, D.C., revving those engines at the Capitol, demanding that the government step up and take real action for the mental health of returning soldiers. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly important question to think about today. What is the true, hidden human cost of maintaining the world's most powerful military force? We've traced this whole journey, from a teenager drawn in by the promise of a better life, through the absolute crucible of basic training, into the horrifying, bond-solidifying reality of combat, and finally to the stark, dual reality of coming home. It is a life cycle defined by extreme sacrifice, unbelievable discipline, and profound trauma. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the human reality living right beneath the uniform. Catch you next time.